Welcome to this episode of Ask Me Anything, where you have an opportunity to hear from some UGA faculty members. My name is Denise Spangler, and I have the honor of serving as the Dean of the Mary Frances Early College of Education here at UGA, a role I've held since 2018. I'm finishing my 25th year on the faculty at UGA, and I'm proud to say I'm also an alum of the institution, graduating with my PhD in 1995. Let me tell you a few things about the College of Education before I introduce our presenters. Our college was named for Mary Frances Early in February of this year. Mary Frances Early was the first African-American graduate of the University of Georgia, graduating in 1962 with her Master of Music Education degree. Our college honors her legacy as a lifetime music educator in the Atlanta Public Schools, at Clark Atlanta University, Spelman College, and Morehouse, as well as her civil rights activism throughout the 60s and desegregating the graduate school at the University of Georgia. I encourage you to learn more about her and about our college on our website, and also to see our magazine, which will be coming at the end of June, that features Miss Early prominently. We are the fourth largest college of education in the country with 4,000 students. The reason we're such a large college is that we are a comprehensive college of education. We have a number of majors that you might not think of as typical in a college of education, including speech pathology, student affairs, exercise science, sport management, and athletic training. About half of our students are undergraduates and half are graduate students. We offer a lot of degrees for working professionals. Although the pandemic has unfortunately caused us to leave campus and do learning online, we have been leaders in online learning for well over a decade. We offer 10 degrees and 9 certificates fully online, leading the university in that enterprise. Let me now turn to introducing our presenters. Stephanie Jones is the Josiah Miggs Distinguished Teaching Professor in the Department of Educational Theory and Practice. Her areas of expertise include literacy, social class and poverty and their effects on education, and social justice education. She came to UGA in 2007 from Teachers College at Columbia University. Hilary Hughes is an associate professor in the Department of Educational Theory and Practice. Her areas of expertise include middle grades education, social justice teacher education, and young adolescents. She came to UGA in 2014 from Virginia Commonwealth University. Together, Dr. Jones and Dr. Hughes co-direct the Red Clay Writing Project, which is a professional learning community for teachers of grades K through 16 to develop themselves as writers and teachers of writing. Dr. Jones and Dr. Hughes are going to describe their thinking about how pre-K through 12 teaching and learning have changed during COVID-19 and how they might continue to change in the future for a few minutes, and then they'll answer your questions. So please be thinking about what you'd like to ask, and I'll be back after they finish their remarks to handle your questions.
Thanks, Denise. I am Hilary Hughes. I'm going to start us off, and then Stephanie will join. What I'm going to do is just provide a brief overview of the article that Stephanie and I wrote for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and then that led us to be interviewed on NPR's On Point. And so what happened was in February and March, when the schools were closing and moving to online platforms at an unprecedented scale, we were talking with educators and students all over the country about their experiences, and what they were telling us made us feel like it was pretty urgent to write about what we were learning. So we wrote an article, an op-ed for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution about how what we were all experiencing as education because of COVID-19 wasn't anything anyone had encountered before. Everyone was experiencing shock and crisis and a gulf of uncertainty, all while trying to comprehend what a new school day might look like in our students' homes. So parents and caregivers, for the most part, aren't educators, and most children and youth aren't used to playing student at home, and most educators aren't used to designing online lessons to send home for parents and caregivers to teach their children. Kids were cut off from their social networks, adults were trying to take care of their families and work from home or figure out how to pay the bills because they lost their jobs. People were losing loved ones and still are. All of this is continuing, and no one could leave their homes. So it was and still is chaos. And so what we were saying in the article was that teaching and learning that was taking place shouldn't be referred to, as people were, as homeschooling, as distance learning, or as online learning, because those genres of teaching and learning have their own theories and their own pedagogies. And so what Stephanie and I call COVID-19 schooling has its own construct with its own unique contexts and its own challenges and its own outcomes, most of which are largely still unknown because we're still in it. So in the piece, we're suggesting that instead of acting as if everything was business as usual and assuming that humans experiencing trauma and crisis could be expected to perform at their usual levels of humanness, whatever that is for different people, we could all still instead take a moment and just be. And for us, that didn't mean totally disregarding any ideas of education or educators connecting with students. It just meant that we could all take a collective breath and acknowledge what was happening around us. And so, because we were and still are in the midst of a global health crisis, and people are being affected in very different but very similar ways, our invitation in the op-ed then, and also in the interview we did on NPR's On Point, was more about letting go of what some of us might normally hyper-focus on, like clean homes, limited screen time, strict daily schedules, completing 40 math problems before we go outside and play. All of the things that we used to know as our normal. And so learning to be for us in this space is also about rethinking our usual systems, our systems that we were used to. As we've seen in the past few months, that when things like this happen, when global crises happen, the bottom falls out. And so teachers we've talked to have said, for instance, how surprised they were that some of their best performing students in school weren't doing as well on the online platform. And what we had to remind people is that it's not about the online platform for most students, it's about that we're all living in a global health crisis. And so it's not being able, for kids, it's not being able to see their friends every day. It's about being stuck in the same place with the same people for 50+ days, most of whom many of us are not used to spending time with. It's just about the bottom falling out of a system that they were used to and not knowing how to function like they used to, like all of us used to. So Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you, Hilary, for getting us started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Stephanie Jones. And as Hilary said, from the very beginning, what we saw when the bottom is falling out from underneath us is that we saw a decompression of the system of education. So some of the things that were once deemed the most important parts of education, like testing, test scores, accountability, evaluations of teachers, school rankings, and even grades and grading, were suddenly the least important things that people were thinking about. Tests were canceled. Schools made decisions to either not grade student work at all or make sure that students' grades didn't go down during the pandemic. Even colleges and universities began announcing that they were dropping the ACT and SAT requirements for admissions. Teachers, this was something else that was happening in the decompression. Teachers in the last decade have really been under fire in media and by the public at large, and a lot of times they feel like by legislators. And all of a sudden, teachers were being praised as heroes. So without the test scores and the standards and the evaluations, they were suddenly seen as humans who were really well-prepared professionals who cared deeply about their students' social, emotional, and academic well-being. And caregivers at home were suddenly wondering how teachers made it look so easy every day. So it might also sound a little contradictory because, like Hilary said, the isolation in the pandemic has caused a lot of feelings of depression and anxiety for a lot of people. But at the same time, as the education system was decompressing, many students were, for the first time in their lives, not overwhelmed with anxiety and depression related to the high pressure nature of schooling. So as many parents and students have said to us that they finally got a break, like we finally get a break. We didn't even know we needed this break, but they saw that especially their young adolescent children and their teenagers were able to decompress themselves. So maybe they didn't even realize how much of their negative mental health was tied to the constant pressures of grades, testing, test scores, test preparation, and not having space in their school lives to experience joy, acceptance, excitement, intrinsic motivation, and learning to be humans in the fullest sense of the world, or of the word. So this decompression of this system has forced a lot of people to ask themselves where we might collectively want public education to go as we move forward through COVID-19 and beyond. Most people don't want to return to business as usual because they've caught a glimpse of something different and more desirable, that they can imagine education functioning differently for our children, for our teenagers, our families, our communities, our teachers, and our society. So really, that's where we are today. Hilary reminded us we're still in this. We're by no means even midway into what's going to be happening. And we're doing a lot of watching, listening, and talking with people as they start to plan, prepare, and dream for what might come next. That's where we are.
All right, thank you, Hilary and Stephanie, for getting us kicked off with some of your thoughts. I wonder if, well, participants, if you'll go ahead and put your questions in the question and answer box, I will pull questions to ask the presenters, but I'll start off with a couple while you get those started. I see one question that's in there already is whether there will be a recording of this session. They are all being put on the university's YouTube channel, and you will get a follow-up email after this. So one of the things you mentioned was testing, and the standardized testing that's been going on as a result of No Child Left Behind, as a way to decide whether children advance to the next grade level, as a way to assess teachers and to give report cards to schools and school systems. How do you envision we might take a look at what happened this year without testing? There were still things like advanced placement testing, but without testing, to think about what the place is of assessment in education. How might we as a community of parents, educators, students come together and think about what the future looks like in assessment?
Do you want me to take that, Hilary? I can start us. Thank you, Denise. Sure, we've actually given a lot of thought to that. And one thing that we would want to say to folks is that when teachers are prepared in their teacher education programs, they learn to assess the learning of the children and the youth that they're working with. They learn to, they have all kinds of tools in their toolkit for assessing that have nothing to do with the high stakes standardized tests, or very little to do with them. So formative assessment, for example, so assessing learning as it's in process and making teaching decisions and instructional decisions in the moment, or pausing for a moment and making instructional decisions for the next day or the next week based on what they see students are doing, is something that teachers are prepared to do. They know how to do that. So one thing that we want to remind people is that testing is a really big industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and since No Child Left Behind came along and testing became mandatory in our public schools, what we've seen, what educators complain about, and what we have seen over the years and what researchers have documented is that those high stakes tests narrow curriculum, they push projects out of the picture, they push out social and emotional focus in schools, they push out the arts, they push out recess. There so much so much time and energy is focused on preparing for those particular tests that the whole experience of education starts to become reduced so much. And that's, in general, educators don't want that. And families haven't necessarily understood what that meant, but a lot of them are beginning to understand that now that their children are home full time. So we would say teachers know how to assess. Local control over assessment is really important, and the state is already facing massive budget cuts, and tests are very expensive. So it's one place in the state budget and in local budgets that we could eliminate and use the professional knowledge of teachers to get back to local control of assessment.
Okay. Might return to that if we have some more time. There's a question about, we are now seeing lots and lots of documented evidence that families of color and families living in poverty are being disproportionately affected by COVID-19. It's also likely that those children in those communities are being disproportionately affected by the shift to online learning, that they don't have access possibly to the technology, to the internet. They may not have adults in the home for whom English is a comfortable language, adults who are there to help them. Those adults may still be working in the service industry. So this is likely, whenever we return to school, to widen the already existing achievement gap. What thoughts do you have about what needs to happen in schools when school resumes, whether it's online or in person in the fall, to try to narrow that achievement gap that is just being made wider at this time?
I'll start on that one. I'm working with a principal of middle school right now. We just had this conversation, the faculty and the administration and I, about this. And if we think about social and emotional learning and well-being first, and we think about the humanness, and we think about education, if we have a population of students who are already historically have been marginalized, and who have experienced trauma and crisis through COVID-19 and before, actually, always, this is a historical thing that hasn't just happened, then bringing anyone back to school, but especially a population who already is seen as a certain way and constructed as behind or deficit, and we say, you're behind, we need to do something, that's just adding more trauma and deficit-oriented perspective to how we construct them. And the other thing that we're talking about with educators is, like, we have to start asking, like, falling behind what? So when we are saying, you know, we're behind in testing, other countries are beating, it's like if it depends on what test you're looking at, and if you look at tests and the way that the data is presented, I mean, and Denise, you know this, and we know this, it depends on how people present data. You can present data any way you want. And so if you look and you don't look at like a flat line and you look over data over time, there's some really good things happening in our country. And there's some really, really, really bad, inequitable things happening in our country. So for us, it's about, what if we took the time to rethink the education system and we change the way that we approach education so that our historically marginalized students we aren't creating that gap for them. Stephanie, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I will. So I work with a lot of teachers in schools on being what we call class sensitive, and meaning that everything that educators and administrators do, they should think about how that's going to differently affect children and families of different social class backgrounds. And we have always known, we have 40 years of documentation that working class and poor children and youth from all racial and ethnic backgrounds tend to fare more poorly in school than their more affluent counterparts. So what we've always known and what we've been trying to mitigate in schools and in classrooms is this very, very wide divide between the haves and the have-nots, if you want to put it that way. And part of that is because we have an unprecedented gulf between the wealthy and the poor in our society. So we've been trying to mitigate that in classrooms and in schools But as soon as everything went home, so one thing that that I always work with administrators on is that number one, if something is important for the success of that child, of that student, they have to have the option of doing it at school. So they have to do it at school. You need to have the resources for them to do it at school, because if you assign something as homework, and then you grade those homework projects or homework assignments as if they were on an equal playing field, then you're just grading social class privilege and marginalization. So as soon as all of school goes home, that is just completely ripped open for all of us to see. As I've talked with so many teachers who, especially in the early grades, yes, a lot of these kids have their own device because schools have devices for all of the children. But children, oh, sorry, y'all, I have a dog in the background. But really, children need paint, they need blocks, they need toys, they need puzzles, they need sand, they need water, they need things to play with, things to build with. And that's what we were so worried about when everything went home, because those material resources, those material objects, that's one way that we can mitigate these vast differences between children and when they come into school. So if in my dream world, we would be doing a lot of delivering of things to people's homes, backpacks filled with hands-on materials that kids and adolescents can be working with, not just the device. So then, of course, you have folks without even access to Wi-Fi, and even our university students. We've read emails from them, and we've talked to them, and people who are parking in a car outside of Chick-fil-A to get online so they can do their homework and their coursework, and that's at the university level. So, and they have a car and they can get there, but what about the fifth grader who just can't? So yes, this is exacerbated all of the inequities that we already knew were there. And hopefully it will show us that doing more testing is not necessarily the answer to mitigating these differences, that it's about thinking in a much more holistic way.
In a somewhat related vein, we've had a couple of people ask questions about students with special needs, where the parents may not be equipped to support them in the way that their classroom teachers would be. The students cannot access online learning in the same way as their differently abled peers. There's not a lot of help available if you just Google how to support a student with special needs. And obviously there's a whole range of students with special needs, but what do you know about what's going on with students with special needs, or what advice do you have for parents who are trying to support a child with special needs without the expertise to know exactly how to meet that particular need?
I'll say that I've talked to a few administrators and teachers, and I mean, all educators have been stepping up just beyond anything we could have imagined the past few months. And the special education people I've talked to have been, it's incredible. Calling people, they're calling every single student every single day, at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, talking with, because they know that their students with special needs want connection and need connection. They have connection in a very different way. So sending things home, like some have been talking about what you said, kids who can't access the things they need to on technology. They have physical things they have been sending home, like what Stephanie was talking about, kind of education in a box. But if they have internet access, they've been Zooming with them, Skyping with them, but just calling in the morning and the afternoon every single day is just to help. And they've been talking to the parents about different things they can do. So I've just heard remarkable stories about what special education teachers have been doing.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add on to that too, Denise. There are also lots of examples where that isn't able to be in place for whatever reason. And I would say to any parents or caregivers who are struggling with that, don't worry about the academics right now. So that might just create too much frustration and anxiety for you and for your child. And there are other things that you can be doing in this moment that they can learn in lots of ways. They can be, maybe it's about cooking, maybe it's about organizing things in the home, maybe it's about things happening in current events in the news, maybe it's about gardening, taking care of a lawn, or whatever it might be. There are other really lovely, super valuable things that people are talking about that their kids are doing now that they never had really the opportunity or time to do before. So I would say, let your teachers know that you're struggling. Tell them that you're going to back off because it might just be creating too much stress and anxiety in your home during a time when there's already too much stress and anxiety. And the teachers they are going to do everything they can when kids finally come back to them, to pick them up right where they are and to do what they need to do to start where they are. They aren't expecting that parents can complete an entire academic year with their students. Teachers just are not expecting that.
And I would say that's true across the board for all students. I've seen teachers posting on social media that having a child help sort the laundry or organize the pantry or clean out the junk drawer or, running errands or delivering groceries to a neighbor, that those are all life skills that will be valuable to those children for many, many years in the future, more so than, and I say this as a math educator, learning your multiplication tables or how to factor a polynomial or something. A question about public health. How are teachers getting ready to address COVID-19 with students, to help students who are at an age where it's appropriate to think about the death and the loss that's happened in the world as a result of COVID-19, but also what is the responsibility of teachers to be teaching health in schools, basic things like hand washing and other kinds of things about public health. Where does that fall, and what's the conversation about things like that? I know we had similar conversations after major world events like 9/11, for instance, about the role of teachers in helping children process something of this magnitude.
Do you want me to go first? All right, that's a great question. I really think that a lot of educators are looking forward to this opportunity to bring in real world issues and bring those into the education in their classroom and integrate it into the curriculum. So, we have preschool and kindergarten teachers who are already fabulous about getting their hands washed multiple times a day and doing all of that kind of health education with very young children. But the system changes really quickly as soon as kids get into even first grade. I mean, first graders have really heavy academic expectations. And I think that a lot of folks are looking forward to broadening what they're doing in the classroom. And how they will do that, I think, is what they're all figuring out right now. Hilary and I, because we work so closely with English language arts teachers from all over the state and country, we've already seen amazing ways that ELA teachers are integrating epidemiology and public health and economic crises and unemployment issues everything around the pandemic. They're creating digital portfolios, they're creating graphic novels, they're journaling. So we already see that teachers in this time have started to integrate that into their curriculum, and they realize that this bringing the lived experience of young people into their learning makes learning more relevant. I also know that teachers have a big question mark about what they even would need to do if they're in person with students. So districts are already talking about a variety of different plans, but educators, they've been educating themselves during these couple of months, but they're also going to need some guidance about what it is that we really need to focus on back in the buildings.
And I'll add to that, you know, I mean, in some schools, there are more police officers than there are counselors. And maybe this is a time to rethink that counselors can be doing things, you know, we can shift aside the work of planning and scheduling and let people who have amazing degrees in counseling help bear the burden of the trauma that everyone in the building is going to be experiencing. So therapists right now are seeing their own therapists so they can get the space they need to help all the people they're working with. And so school counselors, you know, it's sad that we have such a funding cut right now in the state, because now would be a good time to hire more support for students. So because teachers have been living this too. So teachers will have their own trauma that they're bringing in, and students, they're going to have students who are, it's going to just manifest differently for everyone. And that's going to be really difficult. And I think teachers already are there for students for the most part. And so then to bring in support would be key. Those are the kind of conversations, just to rethink, instead of being like, oh, how can we work within this existing system? The system's wrecked. It fell out. Let's rethink the system to support more people.
And for those of you who are from Georgia, I know we have participants from all over the country and maybe even all over the world, but our colleague Peter Smagorinsky writes regularly for the Get Schooled blog in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which is where Stephanie and Hilary wrote their piece. Peter has a piece today that's about attending to the mental health concerns and social and emotional needs of students and teachers. So I think this is an interesting two-part question. There's both the social and emotional, but then there's the curricular piece. Teachers who become certified in health and physical education there is a health curriculum in most states for children from kindergarten through 12th grade. There's also a science curriculum that has a health component to it. But what it makes me think is that at the University of Georgia, we need to partner with our School of Public Health, which actually shares building space with us, with our curriculum to think about how do we bring this in. We have colleagues at Georgia who are looking right now at how people understand the math of these various graphs that are being put out there. And so that's a place where math teachers can work with middle school and high school students on looking at the graphs of some of the data, where you can accomplish some math learning objectives while also learning about this current event. This actually segues into another question, which was about, none of us know. We don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what's going to happen with the virus over the summer. We don't know how the University of Georgia is going to look in the fall. We're planning for face-to-face instruction, but we don't know. And K-12 school systems don't know that either in terms of hybrid learning, alternating days. What do you know about what schools are considering for ways that they can return safely in the fall? And do you have any professional recommendations on how we might do that?
I mean, since I'm not in healthcare, I mean, I read the CDC website every day, and all of their suggestions for reopening. But I've heard of lots of models. I've been reading. I mean, Denise, you mentioned a model for different universities. I think there were 11 models or something one day. So, I mean, I'm reading about lots of models that people are talking about. But I feel like that's where, if people are talking to me about curriculum design or equity-oriented practices or assessment. That's my area, and I would love to hear from scientists and people in healthcare to help us figure that out, because kids, I mean, I'm thinking about middle school kids, that's what they love. They're just all over each other. So, I mean, I've read stuff about no more than 10 people in a classroom and they can't pass each other in the hallway and they'll eat in the same space and the same group of kids will be together all day. And then the schools will be cleaned and disinfected every day. And it's just, it's a lot. There are a lot of models popping up everywhere, and it'll just be interesting to see what people do. Stephanie?
Right. So I'm in the same boat as most people, and that's just every single day reading a different kind of plan that's coming out of a school district or a university. And of course, probably most of you on here have read a lot of those as well. And that goes from some schools saying we're only going to be online, I mean, at the university level, we're only going to be online in the fall, and we're probably also going to be online in the spring of 2021. I think Cambridge University came out and said that they all the way through next spring they would be online. And then others are trying to think about that education is always more than just the content or the curriculum. And it's always about human relationships. It's always about place and space and what we do together. So I think that my recommendation would be, don't make a decision too quickly or too publicly. To be slow and thoughtful and take things as they come, because I think that sometimes when we make decisions too quickly and then we might feel like we have to dig in our heels to stick with that no matter what. And I think it's going to have to be fluid and dynamic and moving. So my recommendation would be slow, thoughtful, thinking about issues of equity. I would have our most vulnerable students at the forefront of my mind, and thinking about how we can serve them the best and work from there. So really prioritize students with special needs, families with special needs, children and families who don't have access to Wi-Fi or internet or devices or material objects that they need. Food, we've seen that schools are very important for the nutrition and health of our students. So I would put those things first and then work from there slowly.
Yeah, and there's a question that I don't think has an easy answer, which is, how is the College of Education at UGA helping school districts model options for the fall, such as all online, students coming in shifts, some sort of hybrid? I suspect that we have people all over the college working on this. I know we have doctoral programs that enroll superintendents and associate superintendents and principals and assistant principals where they're talking about these things. We have a learning design and technology group that specializes in online learning that is supporting people. We work with, we have about 300 partnerships and agreements with different schools, school districts, all over the state and even outside the state. So I suspect that we have too many to even count in terms of the ways that people are interacting. But at the moment, most places are waiting for direction from state government to figure out what they're doing. But UGA faculty and staff will be there to support districts when they're ready to think about some of these things. A question was raised that relates to a comment that was made about investing in counselors. One of the other things that's been eroded due to budget cuts over the last decade or so is paraprofessionals. Do you have thoughts on how paraprofessionals might be used to support students and teachers in classrooms, whatever they look like in the future?
Am I going? I mean, and for, you know, there are so many, that is a big question. And I would take it with paraprofessionals and counselors and any other support. Schools in our country are so spread thin for the most part. And we do so much with so little that has become the normal. And so it's so easy for people to look in who aren't in that space and say, well, they're doing fine. They don't need extra. They don't need paraprofessionals. They're functioning. And if you've ever been in a classroom, which I have several, where you have 2 people teaching, even if you have 12 students or 25 students, it is a remarkable difference. And so if we're playing our dream game today, if everyone had a lead teacher and an assistant teacher, imagine what people could do. And if they were training, if there was training and professional learning wrapped around how to collaborate in teaching. I mean, there is lots of it, but I mean, for everyone. So of course, anytime we have an option for having more support, then, and I'm not going overboard. I don't mean like every single classroom every day, all the time, but something more than we have now. I'm in huge support of that, but we have no money, so it's getting cut. So,
although I would just add that as budgets are cut, that that teachers and communities and administrators can come together and have a conversation about what they want to prioritize. And now more than ever, we need people on the ground who can be responsive and compassionate and supportive to the children and the teachers who are going to be back in schools. So if you're making budget cuts, then I would recommend that you do everything you can to not cut positions that are in direct support of children and teachers, that there are other places to cut budgets.
And hopefully this is a place where colleges of education around the country can be helpful when our students are back with us and they can go out and have field experiences. They can also be some of those additional adults providing support in classrooms. But that all remains to be seen how that rolls out in the fall. I know there have been some raised about introducing another adult with a whole other set of germs into schools as well in some districts. We've got a couple of questions about both sort of how much online learning is appropriate developmentally for children of various ages, how much sitting in front of the computer, but then also when you've hit that limit for sitting in front of the computer, what are some things that some students who are intrinsically motivated might do to continue to challenge themselves if it's not just online learning? So maybe the developmentally appropriate amount of online learning first, and then thoughts on how students who are interested might continue to challenge themselves.
Okay, I can take a stab first. So we're in this very strange contradiction right now where experts have for years said limit screen time of young children. And, there are schools, private schools, who serve the children of big tech companies in Silicon Valley, for example. And some of those schools don't even allow the children to have a computer in their classroom until they're in 6th grade. So they are building things, they're making things, they're constructing things, they're reading real books, they're writing on paper with their hand, they're drawing, they're painting, they're acting, they're writing poetry, they're writing screenplays. So all of this to say that now all of these ideas are colliding. And we know for decades that experts have said we need to limit the screen time of young children, especially elementary age, and that even too much screen time for teenagers can be detrimental for them in a variety of ways. So I can't, there's no one answer to what is developmentally appropriate for different age groups. But I would say that the move, I can just talk about some examples that I've heard, actually. So I've heard of high schoolers who are getting their work done in 90 minutes, 2 hours a day. So that's been happening since the pandemic, and they wake up around 10 or 11 o'clock, they log on, they do 90 minutes to 2 hours of work, they're done for the day, they go out for a run, they're making lots of baked goods, they're playing with their pets, whatever, they're growing some lettuce. And then you hear of, in a lot of those stories that I'm hearing are coming from more affluent school districts. And then I hear other stories that are, at least the stories I've heard, are coming from more working class and poor school districts. And a lot of those, not a lot, some of those places have continued to expect teachers to teach live online all day long, still holding their classes, all of their classes from 7:30 until 3 or whatever it is. And students have been expected to be online. And I don't have an answer, but I hope that even just contrasting some of those stories up against one another can just provoke some thought about who are we expecting to be tied to their screen all day, and who do we give the freedom to make some other choices and to do some different things. If they're interested in engineering and building things and taking apart the toaster and rebuilding the microwave, where do educators expect that might happen, and in what places are expecting that kids really need to be staring one-to-one on a computer all day. And a lot of times that lines up with more affluent districts, kids not having as much screen time, and more districts with working class and poor kids. Even during the regular school year, they were already spending a lot of screen time, even during the regular school day. So I think that we know that, if I would say to families, just any kind of frustration and anxiety is not worth it. So I even personally, when we have too many Zoom meetings, my body is hurting, my head is hurting, my eyes are hurting, and I'm a middle-aged woman who's used to a lot of screen time. So we just need to be mindful and pay attention to how kids are responding, and just opt out when it looks like it's too much, and do a lot of play, especially for younger kids, 6th grade and younger. Get them playing, and outside if they can, or inside if you have to, but using real objects.
Okay, we've got about 4 minutes left and 2 questions left in the Q&A. One is to flip this conversation away from kids to teachers, and about the inequity from the perspective of the educators. So there are teachers who don't have high-speed internet. There are teachers whose own children are at home with them. There are teachers who have spouses or partners who are also working from home, or who may have lost their jobs. There may be teachers who are caregivers for elderly parents or relatives. There are teachers who have friends and relatives who have COVID or who have died. What thoughts do you have about this for teachers and educators more broadly, assistant principals, counselors, all of our educators? How do we think about our educators right now?
mean, I can say a little bit, just the same way as our children, that everybody is experiencing a global health crisis. And so to expect teachers to, which is what a lot of school districts have, expected teachers to design lessons and make videos and every single day collect work, check it, do Zoom meetings with their classes twice a week, every day, however often. And that those things, we have to think about the humanity of the teachers and all of the personnel, all the faculty and staff. That if that can't happen, then it can't happen. And maybe I can just, if students need to connect, then we'll do a Google Meet or something, or I'll set it up for you and you all can, or just a lot of flexibility. For me, I just feel like the fluidity could be there more, and flexibility and being open and not having to be sure about everything. Because I know that some parents want that, like they need that because we want to control something when we have control over nothing right now, but we can't. So we just got to do the best we can and help support our teachers' emotional needs too.
Yeah, and I would just add that just one very specific story, an elementary school teacher contacted me and wrote a very long email. She's working at home like almost all other teachers. Her partner was working around the clock, afraid that he was going to lose his job. And they have 2 elementary age children at home. And she said, I've already been in the bathroom twice this morning crying. So I'm barely surviving here. And my principal and my school and the families are expecting that I'm going to be online in a few minutes to engage all of my students. And this is an impossible situation. So anytime I hear another teacher who was driving about 20 minutes away to get to a parking lot where she could log on to Wi-Fi because she didn't have Wi-Fi, and she had 3 of her 3 little kids in the back seat because she's the primary caregiver, and her partner was at work, physical work, and the only way that she could do her job was to drive with her 3 kids in the back seat and sit in a parking lot and log on to Wi-Fi. So I always think about those 2 stories in particular, and yeah, lots of flexibility and lots of grace and generosity. And that's also hard because some of the families who really need help, their children were with teachers who are in a position right now that they just might not be able to help them very much.
All right, last question, and we could spend an hour on this last question, but you're going to have to be brief. This person says, I'm frustrated about watching my community where education's not prioritized. I see salary cuts, I see unfair standards of assessments, I see program cuts. How can I help? How can my peers and I make this concern known as community members and taxpayers? 60 seconds apiece, go. I'll start for you, vote.
I was just gonna say, there's so many legislators you can call and write letters to your legislation. That's what they're there for. I've been writing so many letters and making so many phone calls whenever the moment arises, and it matters. It matters, and we can just do so much more as daily active citizens than we have been.
Yeah. The one thing I would add is over and over and over to say our teachers deserve to have control over their curriculum and assessment. So we want local control. And anytime there's a conversation, if you take it to a level of where is the local control, then I think that we can be more responsive to children, families, and teachers.
And I will just echo, I was a member of my local Board of Education, an elected school board member for 12 years. You would be surprised at how little contact school board members get from the public and how very impactful that is. I have watched board members sit at the table and say, I heard from the community that, and when you press them, they say, oh, well, from 2 people after church. Your voice matters, and all politics is local. So you can argue on the federal level, the state level, but all politics is local. I would really encourage you to make your voice heard locally. I want to thank all of you for being here as part of this session, and thanks Stephanie Jones and Hilary Hughes for presenting. I would encourage you to visit our website at coe.uga.edu to learn more about our work. And in the spirit of that last question, I'm pretty sure if I asked you, you could think of one of your K through 12 teachers who made a difference in your life. I bet if I asked you, you could even name maybe a dozen teachers that you had over time. They may not have all had a huge impact, but I bet you can still name your teachers, even probably your first grade teachers. So I encourage you to take the time to thank a teacher, a counselor, a principal, a speech therapist, some educator from some point in your life, one of your teachers, one of your child's teachers, a friend or an acquaintance who's an educator. I hope that the massive shifts in education during COVID-19 have taught us to appreciate and value educators and the work they do. And I hope that we'll have an opportunity to think collectively about what we want education to be like in the future. Today's presentation has been part of the Alumni Association's Ask Me Anything series. Please check out the upcoming sessions at alumni.uga.edu. Thank you again for coming, and stay well and be safe.